Thank you, Excellencies, fellow naval flag officers and commodores, distinguished policy leaders from academia and defense industry, Steve Loosley, Peter Jennings, and friends. I see Rear Admiral Brad Hicks in the audience, a destroyer man and true leader on missile defense and for the U.S. Navy and industry. He mentored me as a young lieutenant junior grade and helped turn me into the naval officer I am today. Thank you, Brad, and thank you for your continued leadership at this conference. I appreciate the kind introduction by Andrew Davies, and thank you for inviting Vice Admiral Tom Roden to speak. He had hoped to be here and sends his regards, and me. This is my 6th time to Canberra. I'm not the slightest bit unhappy about being here. It is the Australian city I visited most and is a wonderfully friendly place, and I'm happy to be back. A big thank you also to the Australian Strategy Policy Institute for organizing this seminal conference. A lot of hard work goes on behind the scenes in arranging a nice venue, distinguished speakers, and a theme. Year after year, you do a superb job, and so I thank you for doing so again this year and affording an opportunity for your leadership and ours to get together and discuss critical issues important to our nations. Yesterday morning after a gym workout, I decided to run from the hotel here to Mount Ainslie Summit. I don't mention this to brag about my athleticism, or lack thereof, as my wife Shannon beat me during the sprint to the top, but because of the remarkable similarity of our two capital cities, as I ran along the long avenue leading from the lake to the Australia War Memorial. First, the beautiful memorials that line ANZAC Parade are so similar to the ones on the Mall of Washington, D.C., memorials honoring the sacrifices of those who served in World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam. I could go on. Second, Canberra's ANZAC Parade stretches from the waters before your great Parliament building to the Australia War Memorial. D.C.'s Mall stretches nearly the same distance from our Parliament building, the U.S. Capitol, to the Lincoln Memorial. Third, our capital cities were designed by foreigners. Yours by American Walter Burley Griffin from Chicago, and ours by a Frenchman, Pierre Lafont. I will leave it to your judgment who got the better deal. However, that's not where the similarities stop. The U.S.-Australian alliance is a legendary one. The war memorials that adorn each of our capital cities remind current and future citizens and visitors that Australian and U.S. service members have fought and died together, and we will continue to stand side by side in every endeavor to stamp out evil that threatens our nations and our alliance. Maritime nations need a strong maritime force. We have navies. Primarily 70% of the earth is covered by water. Roughly 80% of the world's population lives in coastal areas, and 90% of the global commerce travels by sea. The world's ports, straits, and sea lanes are of historic interest to us because anything that affects them causes economic ripples that ultimately affect its citizens. Security and strategy are critically important to the economic prosperity of every nation. Naval forces are often used in global security environment characterized by volatility, instability, complexity, and interdependencies. The convergence of a strategic maritime interest in the Indo-Asia-Pacific region to include the security of critical energy and trade routes, the denial of free passage to terrorists and weapons of proliferators, and the need for effective responses to natural disasters have led to a greater mutual desire for deeper naval maritime cooperation between nations in the Asia-Pacific region. The economic surge in the Asia-Pacific was due in part of the increased production of goods and demand for energy. Over half the world's tonnage travels through the Straits of Malacca, Sunda, and Lombok in the Indo-Singapore region. A third of the global crude oil and half of the liquid natural gas moves through the South China Sea. 5 of the top 15 trading partners in the U.S. are in this region. The U.S. Navy's plan for the Asia-Pacific region is significant. We are deploying more forces to the region and will increase ship presence in the region from 52 ships today to about 65 ships in 2020. The Navy will rebalance home ports to reach 60% in the Pacific by 2020, and we will field new capabilities focused on the Indo-Asia-Pacific challenges and deploy platforms with new capabilities to this region. It has been said many times, the oceans aren't getting any smaller, and the world is not getting safer. And I know that hasn't been lost on Australia's leaders, elected and military. Australia inhabits a unique world in our place. You straddle that line between Asia and the West, which brings a specific understanding of sensitivity to events in both spheres. During World War II, we witnessed the balance of power shift in the Pacific as enemy forces subsumed more territory, more islands, and gained dominance over Asia-Pacific. That tide turned as Western forces joined together to repel the invaders and eventually restore peace to the region. Australia's role was pivotal and critical, providing personal resources and a place from which to stage a defense and then rebound to offense. Since the end of World War II, the Pacific has been anything but peaceful. Granted, there have been periods of relative quiet where commerce countered conflict and old enemies became partners. Again, Australia has artfully managed that balance between the West and Asia-Pacific, supporting peace and stability efforts while standing strong for regional partners. But there is a changing regional dynamic, and the world has become less safe again. And for maritime nations such as Australia and the United States, we rely on sea lanes remaining open and available for free navigation. There are those who wish to curtail the free navigation and attempt to constrict movement through international waters, who create land areas where there were none, who create exclusion zones where there should be shared use, and who ensure neighboring nations know a large military and economic power is expanding. Australia is rightfully concerned with providing security for itself and foremost, as any nation would. You have a vested interest in maintaining stability in the South Pacific and then beyond that in Southeast Asia. Asia-Pacific nations look to each other for mutual support to stop aggressors and also look over the horizon to our two nations for reassurances and resources. Our interests are linked with those in the Pacific. We have overlapping interests and rely on each other by necessity and by shared values. Australia and the United States share a Pacific presence and a role in preserving unimpeded navigation of oceans. Partner nations rely on us to provide support. For America, we do this through forward presence, or as Vice Admiral Tom Roden likes to say, being where it matters, when it matters. The United States just released its updated maritime strategy a couple weeks ago, aptly titled A Cooperative Strategy for a 21st Century Sea Power. That strategy focuses on two fundamental principles. The first is that forward naval presence is critical for our security, to deter conflict, respond to crises, defeat aggression, protect the maritime commons, strengthen partnerships, and provide humanitarian assistance in disaster response. It also calls for merging our individual capabilities and capacity, which produces a combined naval effect that is greater than the sum of its parts, in reference to operations with partner nations. An advantage for our nations and our navies is the extensive network of our alliances, partnerships, and coalitions. By leveraging the robust capacity of navies worldwide, we are better postured collectively to face new and emerging challenges in the 21st century. The surface Navy comprises roughly 70% of the commissioned ships in the U.S. Navy. At any given point, a little over 50% of our ships are deployed around the globe. That global presence is weighted toward the Pacific. And since the topic I've been asked to address is the future of the U.S. surface fleet, I'd like to give you an update of our newest class of ships, the Littoral Combat Ships and Zumwalt class ships, both of which are planned to occupy a great deal of their deployment time in this region. Since the Australian Strategy Policy Institute is known as a great forum to discuss ideas and concepts, I thought it may also be good time to discuss Vice Admiral Tom Roden's new concept for the U.S. surface fleet, known as distributed lethality. The United States is committed to maintaining her historic Pacific presence and has dedicated 60% of her forces to the Pacific, rebalancing personnel and material to keep her focus on the Pacific area of operations. We have begun operating littoral combat ships out of Singapore, and we will operate more. The first ship in the program was procured in 2005, and a total of 23 have been procured through 2015. The Navy's proposed 2016 budget, which is on Capitol Hill now, requests funding for the procurement of 3 more littoral combat ships. The littoral combat ship, the shipbuilding plan, continues with more ships being christened or under construction, preparing to join the fleet. That is, 4 more ships will deliver in 2015, and 12 more ships are under construction. USS Freedom completed a successful initial deployment, participating in multinational exercises, and while on her way back to San Diego, was tasked with supporting humanitarian assistance to the Philippines following Typhoon Haiyan. She proved the concept of operations for LCS employment and became an operational asset almost immediately. Her sister ship, USS Fort Worth, is operating out of Singapore now on a 16-month deployment. The deployment sounds exceptionally long, but every 4 months, a new, well-trained crew arrives in Singapore to relieve the sister crew, which flies home. This is part of the LCS 3-2-1 construct: 3 crews for 2 holes, with 1 ship always operating forward. This concept rotates different crews through a cycle of being deployed and operational to returning stateside from deployment for rest and training to start the cycle all over again. Almost immediately after arriving in these waters, USS Fort Worth was called to support the search and recovery of the tragic crash of AirAsia Flight 8501. Multinational exercises followed those operations too. Each evolution and each operation provides us a better understanding in the U.S. Navy of the infrastructure needed and whether the scope of operations can be expanded. We will be sending more LCS to the Asia-Pacific region as they are launched into the fleet. They have a shallow draft, which allows us to get into areas and ports where many of our larger ships cannot. They are high-speed, multi-mission capable, and highly automated, and they have performed well in the heavy seas of the South Pacific. LCS will bring important capabilities to this region and to the U.S. Navy. The U.S. Coronado and USS Independence have played significant roles as well. The Austral variant of the littoral combat ship is doing well, though neither USS Independence nor USS Coronado have operated in this region yet. Last summer, USS Independence was fully incorporated into the international exercise RIMPAC and is currently operating in the Gulf off the coast of Florida, putting the Mine Countermeasures mission module through its paces. Continuing to demonstrate our long-time friendship with Australia, several Australian Navy officers will join the U.S. Navy to ride USS Independence, LCS-2, during further testing of the Mine Countermeasure mission module this summer near Panama City, Florida. And this past September, USS Coronado, LCS-4, launched a naval strike missile in a successful proof of concept which could increase further combat capability of LCS and other U.S. surface ships. USS Coronado has been operating the ranges off the coast of Southern California, going through certifications, qualifications, and as a testbed for follow-on littoral combat ships. The follow-on surface combatant ships have been designated as frigates and will have commonality with littoral combat ships. However, the new frigate will offer improvements in capability, lethality, and survivability. To this end, the U.S. Navy is working closely with Australia to learn more from its Navy experience with operating aluminum ships in an operational environment and Australia's experience with critical weight reduction efforts. Our fleet is growing and evolving to better counter threats and assure partner nations of our intent and capabilities to support them. On the horizon is the new stealthy Zumwalt class guided missile destroyer, which has a very low radar cross signature, the largest guns built into a ship since World War II, and some high-end technologies, including the fact that it is completely electric. She is a 610-foot ship with a tumble-home hull. The expectation is that the Zumwalt class DDGs will be deployed in the Pacific, bringing unique capabilities along with significantly greater firepower. And with new ships, we have a new concept underway within the U.S. Surface Force. It is not subtle and it is not accidental. The Surface Force is focused on a bold new strategy to give the operational commander options to employ naval combat power in anti-access, anti-denial environment. The surface fleet will always defend the high-value and mission-essential ships. That is our core doctrine. To address the emergence of sophisticated sea denial strategies, Vice Admiral Tom Roden laid out a plan in January, a new concept known as distributed lethality. I am particularly appreciated Chief of Navy Vice Admiral Tim Barrett's shared belief that lethality must be a core requirement. Once again, our navies are aligned. Increasing surface force lethality, particularly in our offensive weapons and the concept of operations for surface action groups, will provide more strike capability to joint force commanders, provide another method to seize the initiative, and add battle space complexity to an adversary's calculus. For more power in more places, to keep our seas open and safe, the Navy should increase the offensive might of the surface force and employ ships in dispersed formations known as hunter-killer surface action groups, which I will address later. The objective is to cause the adversary to shift his own defenses to counter our thrusts. He will be forced to allocate critical and limited resources across a larger set of defended targets, thereby improving our operational advantage to exploit adversary forces. This shift is necessary for several reasons. First, when the Cold War ended, our Navy emerged unchallenged, and the dominance allowed the U.S. Navy to focus on projecting power ashore. Our proficiency in land attack and maritime security operations reached new heights, while certain foundational skills in anti-submarine warfare and anti-surface warfare slowly began to erode. During this period, the mindset of our surface warrior officers slowly transformed from offensive to defensive. The surface force began to shift its expertise to launching Tomahawk missiles in contested sanctuaries at sea. When the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Greenert, took office, he told sailors in the U.S. Navy that he had three principles that he wanted us to focus on: warfighting first, operate forward, and be ready. For Vice Admiral Tom Roden and the Surface Navy, that means we must be ready to counter rapidly evolving missile, air, submarine, and surface threats that will challenge our ability to sail where we need to, when we need to. Second, the shift to the offensive responds to the development of increasingly capable A2AD weapons and sensors designed specifically to deny U.S. naval forces the freedom of maneuver necessary to project power. Adversaries who diminish the deterrent value of forward deployed forces negatively impact the assurances that U.S. provides to friends and allies. A shift to the offensive is necessary to create more favorable conditions to project power where required. Third, the shift to offense is pivotal for the Surface Navy to reinforce closer integration with the Marine Corps. A more fully integrated Marine Corps Surface Force combat team will provide persistent presence that can influence and control events at sea and in the littorals, applying the right capability to the right target for the Joint Force Commander. Supported by other elements of the Joint Force, this integrated Navy-Marine Corps striking force will be increasingly called upon to tend to the nation's security needs around the world. Finally, the shift in the offensive makes the most effective and efficient use of significant investments made in surface force lethality over the past 2 decades. These visionary investments were made by our naval leaders who recognized our dominant position was not a birthright, and the challenges to our ability to keep the seas open were emerging. These investments in enhanced surface ship lethality create the conditions for renaissance in surface force employment and a return to the core competencies of sea control when applied with the bold new offensive methods I've mentioned here. The enablers of this shift to the offensive are an array of existing platforms and capabilities, planned capabilities in various stages of acquisition, and future capabilities resident in today's promising research and development programs. Employing the concept of distributed lethality, the surface force, through innovation, emerging command and control concepts, and increased ability to operate within an acceptable margin of risk, will flexibly adapt to further maritime operations, exploiting seized areas of localized sea control to generate larger combat effects. Distributed lethality is the condition gained by increasing the offensive power of individual components of the surface force. That is, cruisers, destroyers, littoral combat ships, amphibious ships, and logistics ships, and then employing them in dispersed offensive formations known as hunter-killer surface action groups. It is the motive force behind offensive sea control. Both parts of the definition are critical, raising the lethality of the force, but operating in the same way, which suboptimizes the investment. Operating hunter-killer SAGs without a resulting increase in offensive power creates an unacceptable risk. Hunter-killer SAGs seize maritime operational areas for subsequent activities, including power projection, performing screening operations for larger formations, and holding adversary land targets at risk. Additionally, distributing power across a large number of more geographically spaced units, adversary targeting is complicated and attack density is diluted. Hunter-killer SAGs are capable of defending themselves against air and missile attack and extend that protection to expeditionary forces conducting offensive operations of their own. This movement will be networked and integrated to support complex operations even when not supported by the carrier air wing and land-based patrol aircraft. As an example, let's jump to 2020. Consider for a moment a scenario that emphasizes a close Navy, Marine Corps, and Allied integration, a hunter-killer SAG, consisting of an LCS with an ASW module, a Flight 3 Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, a Zumwalt class destroyer, and an Australian air warfare destroyer are ordered to deploy to the vicinity of a small, abandoned island, with an airfield that the Joint Forces Maritime Component Commander plans to seize and use as a temporary expeditionary operations base for 6 Marine Corps F-35Bs. The hunter-killer SAG just described is capable of the following: targeting and destroying the enemy SAG and fast patrol vessels, identifying and destroying land targets ashore, identifying and destroying air and missile threats to the expeditionary air operation, providing wide area surveillance, and locating and destroying enemy submarine threats. It can do this while supported by either carrier or land-based aircraft, but it would not require this support to accomplish its mission. Every capability described is either in the force or in a budgeted acquisition program. This combination of increasing lethal surface forces with F-35B configured amphibious force creates a significant threat to adversary forward operating bases and creates additional planning and targeting problems for the adversary. In addition to adding offensive punch to traditional cruiser destroyer platforms, consideration should be given to applying principles of distributed lethality and sea control to the amphibious force as well. In this scenario, let's say an amphibious readiness group formed around a new Australian LHD and a U.S. Navy Flight 3 Arleigh Burke-class destroyer. There is a strong argument to add offensive capability to the amphibious fleet, creating with it yet another planning nightmare for its adversary, who would face expeditionary forces packing organic offensive surface-to-surface missiles and land attack capabilities. Adding offensive firepower to the amphibious force does not relieve the surface force from its role of protection, nor does it mean that the primary mission of those ships, protecting Marine Corps power ashore must be compromised. It does mean, however, that we should think differently about those ships, the mix of ships, in this case, the Australian LHD and a US DDG, and consider the power of it adding additional capability to them. In short, as Vice Admiral Tom Roden says, the whole becomes much greater than the sum of the parts, with an Australian-US capability-based force structure. There are many other examples where U.S. Navy surface and amphibious ships have been able to support a wide range of missions in the Pacific, delivering aid or rescuing and transporting evacuees, as well as getting the Marines and their gear to the right place at the right time. U.S. Marines will arrive in Darwin, Australia this April to begin a 6-month training evolution. While in Australia, they will undertake a range of training activities, including bilateral training with the Australian Defence Force and New Zealand Defence Force. The rotation of these Marines is a tangible demonstration of the United States' sustained commitment to the U.S.-Australian alliance and to the Asia-Pacific region, and will improve security cooperation activities, disaster relief cooperation, and the ability to respond to various crises throughout the region. This commitment has been further enhanced by the Australia-United States Defense Trade Cooperation Treaty, which went into effect in May of 2013. It established the political basis for expanding our already robust history of joint exercises and training. It laid the groundwork for increased cooperative engagement between our navies and removed barriers to the exchange of technology, ideas, defense materials, and information. As a result, in the future, we will be able to more effectively operate together by cooperatively leveraging the genius of both our nations. We will be able to increase the lethality of our respective surface navies and more effectively meet the security threats of the future. The topic given for today's session is the future of the surface fleet. The future is going to require that we continue to work together, to work collaboratively with partner nations to shape the operational environment to lower the chance for conflict. Stability is good for everyone, but where and when the equilibrium changes, we need to be prepared to react. Having forward presence makes responding to emerging events that much faster and effective. Here's something that remains a constant for both our navies. We both face the challenge of matching resources with requirements. In our case, our combatant commanders, whether PACOM, CENTCOM, or others, have planned requirements which are placed alongside emergent requirements, and our ships have to answer the demand signal. Distributed lethality combines more powerful ships with innovative methods of employing them. It capitalizes on the inherent advantages of surface forces, that is, mobility and persistence, to provide meaningful deterrence to adversary aggression and immediately available warfighting options should deterrence fail. The more capable platforms the adversary has to account for, the more thinly distributed his surveillance assets will be, and more diluted will his attack densities become. An advantage for us. You see, quantity has a quality of all its own. The more distributed our combat power becomes, the more targets we hold at risk, and the higher the cost of defense to the adversary. By applying the principles of distributed lethality, the surface force can help sustain and extend the competitive advantage of America and our allies in power projection against a growing set of sea denial capabilities. It is the Pacific Ocean which separates us geographically and binds us practically as partner nations. Our fleets each navigate the Pacific, demonstrating how we are connected to each other as political partners and as guarantors of regional stability. Thank you for this opportunity to discuss the U.S. Navy Surface Force and Vice Admiral Tom Roden's concept of distributed lethality. I expect you will be hearing more on this new construct. Finally, thank you again to the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. It's great to be back in Canberra, spending time with our friends here in Australia, and I look forward to talking with you more throughout the duration of this conference. Thank you very much.